Hartelijk welkom bij Estafette. Voor dit laatste gesprek zijn wij aangeland bij het wereldberoemde Divinity College in Boston. Hier ontmoeten wij iemand die geboren werd in Roemenië. Als kind ging ze op de vlucht voor de oorlog en later studeerde ze theologie in Duitsland. Nu doceert ze aan deze Harvard Universiteit in Massachusetts. Ze werd de leidende figuur in het feministische denken in theologie en kerk. En ze ontdekte dat vooral vrouwen een veel belangrijkere rol hebben gespeeld dan aanvankelijk werd gedacht. Mag ik je voorstellen aan Elisabeth Schüssler Fiorenza. Professor Elisabeth Schüssler Fiorenza, good afternoon. Where were you born?
I was born in Romania. That was previously belonged to Austria-Hungary as a monarchy, and was partitioned and is a border town between Romania, Hungary, and former Yugoslavia or Serbia. And I grew up there until the war, and during the war we fled because there was street fighting when the Russians moved in, the Germans moved out, the people moved from village to village, and we ended up first in Austria and then in Bavaria, and then we moved to where I grew up in Franken, which is around 70 kilometers, Frankfurt, Würzburg, Heidelberg, in this area. So one of my most liveliest memories is my mother never could go out, and because they didn't take much with them, they had packed a little bit, like a suitcase full of good clothes, but nothing for normal days, no food and so on. So my mother never managed to go begging, and my grandmother always did it in order to get food. And
she went begging?
Begging, yeah, because you couldn't otherwise have food. So I remember quite distinctly that she got some cake from someone, and the children in my family, the children always get things first. So we children had the cake, and we enjoyed it very much. And I could not understand why all the grown-ups were standing around crying and saying, these poor children, they will never get any cake to eat in their life. And every time I eat cake, I say, oh, that's probably why I eat too much cake, because
yes.
of this memory. So I have these snapshot memories of it, and which are more interesting than actually disturbing. If I would have been older, it would have been quite a different experience, I think. I grew up, I was born in a border town, but it also has become almost a kind of symbol for my life to be always on the borders and always to transgress borders. So that's why I say it is not, for me it is not a terrible memory, but it's a memory which is very realistic. And when I talk to people here who have never experienced war, I always realize how different my childhood was, for example, from that of my daughter or that of Francis.
Did these experiences in the war of not having enough to eat influence you in your later choices you made in life?
Well, I'm sure that my whole theological approach in terms of liberation theological approach is influenced by this, because I think we can understand the situation of others only fully if we have some similar experiences. And for me, the greatest number of people today are really displaced persons, if you look at it. And the migration, which is part of the globalization issue, is a very important fact in our life, and I think has not been taken seriously enough in the area of theology or religious reflection. I have argued that because of the discussion here about so-called resident aliens or alien residents, and aliens are some people from outer space, and the difficulty for people here to, especially from Mexico and Latin America, to get a visa in order to stay here and to be permanent immigrants here. I have argued that feminist theologians ought to understand ourselves as resident aliens within the church as well as within the academy. So I think being born in a border town, having transgressed many borders in my life when I was quite young, has had a great impact on my theological thinking.
Why did you go to America then?
Francis, my husband, and we met as students, got married, and he is American, and he would have had no chance in Germany to get, because if America is very reluctant to let in immigrants, Germany is worse against foreigners. so he would have had no chance of a career in Germany, and I, as a woman, as a Roman Catholic woman, had no chance at all. But the real reason is why we came to why we settled in the States and not in Germany is because there was no possibility for a woman in Germany to do theology. My understanding, women become feminists when they realize that their socialization and what they actually want to do are in conflict. So for me, there was a conflict in terms of the socialization into femininity. And my love for books, my love for reading, my love for intellectual issues. And this kind of conflict, I think, is the roots of my feminism.
What attracts you to theology?
But I'm interested in theology is, you could say I have started to study theology during the council, or just before the council. Then Pope John announced the council, and then the council came. And I remember quite clearly I had made a promise. There was a rumor that Karl Rahner would be silenced. And I had made a promise if Karl Rahner would be silenced, I would have nothing to do with theology, and I would do probably sociology. But if Karl Rahner would not be silenced, I would do theology. And Karl Rahner was not silenced, and the council came, and theology was exciting because you could ask all kind of questions. For me, studying theology was intellectually exciting,
liberating,
and was liberating because it meant that intellectual freedom meant and for me, good theology was that you had the intellectual freedom to ask the questions you needed to ask, whether or not they were conform with the doctrinal system or not. It's almost hard to explain this because we are now again in a period where they try to close all doors and windows, and I'm sure if I would be a young woman today, I would not, a young Catholic woman today, I would not go and study theology.
Wouldn't you?
No, in terms of, I would maybe come to Harvard and study it, where you have a kind of inter-religious atmosphere, and where you have a place where you can still ask all the questions. But if I would go to Catholic institutions, and in Germany you have to go to Catholic or Protestant institutions, today there is a lot of the freedom which was there during the Council and through the Council is already cut down. For instance, I got just a letter asking me to react to this new stupid regulation from Rome, and I got a letter saying from the Women's Ordination Conference, and they said, we ask you because nobody in Catholic institution can afford to look at it critically. Or, for instance, in Germany, you did not have women for a long time, Catholic women as professors because of the Concordat, which the Church did with Hitler. And Sylvia Schröer was denied, was not given the permission to do theology, and what she had said was very mild in comparison. And I understand now that 2 feminists have been appointed in Germany to chairs, but the condition was that they publicly made it known that they agreed with the Pope on the question of women's ordination. So that is how bad the situation today is already in terms of a Catholic kind of context and framework.
You have become well known for your pioneering New Testament study. You wrote a book in memory of her. It's an intriguing title.
The title of the book comes from a story in Mark's Gospel, which is also found in Matthew and in a very different form in Luke's text. And the story is about a woman anointing Jesus' head. And at the end of the story, it is said that what she has done will be told in memory of her, and wherever the gospel is proclaimed. And so I took this as a leitmotif to move into the whole new reconstruction of Christian origins in feminist terms. I try to unravel in the story, with the story, that although the text is quite explicitly saying what she has done will be told in memory of her, most Christians do not know anything about this woman. And wherever the gospel is proclaimed, certainly what she has done is not told. And so I was taking this as a paradigm for the situation of women in early Christian history, and particularly in early Christian history, that women have participated in religion, women have participated especially in the beginnings of religion and in the beginnings of Christianity, but what they have done is forgotten and is not told. So the theological consciousness that the gospel, to say it the other way around, cannot be proclaimed if what women have done is not told, has been lost. And you could say the other history, the history that has become predominant in the history of Christianity, the texts, those texts which are also in the Christian Testament, are those texts that say women should be silent and women should not speak in public, or women should not speak in church. These texts have made history, but the text which is ascribed to Jesus in Mark's Gospel, that wherever the Gospel is proclaimed, what she has done will be told in memory of her, in remembrance of her, that these texts have never been realized in history, and that we are at a moment that through the feminist movement we can recover this part of the gospel story. It was very interesting to me. I had a long debate when the book was published in German, because the German publisher did not want to have the title exactly because of this allusion to the Lord's Supper.
Why?
They thought it was too much, or they could not quite bring the two together.
And when was it?
Because what I do is really to put, by choosing this title, to put the woman and the memory of the woman on the same level with the memory of Jesus. And for some churchmen, that is a little difficult.
When you investigated women, the role of women in New Testament, I wonder, what was your most remarkable discovery?
I don't know. I think why In Memory of Her has become so influential is because it brings together, it places women in the center of the historiography, and therefore assumes that women are central figures. And I think that is against all our cultural kind of sensibilities, and especially also our religious and theological sensibilities. And it does so in terms of the theoretical frameworks that are available to scholars today. So I really think what I have done is opened up a whole new field of studies just by this this move to place women in the center.
Were you conscious you were doing that?
I was very conscious because at one point I used to work nights, and in the middle of the night I had all this material, but somehow it did not gel, it did not come together. And at one point it came clear to me that my problem was that I wrote for two different audiences. I had from the beginning said that I wanted to do a scholarly book, but in the 70s, and I wanted to do a feminist book, but in the 70s, in many feminist circles, for instance, scholarship was male. And for many scholars, feminism was ideology. So I realized suddenly that I tried to bring the impossible two together. And I realized that, and I said to myself, Elisabeth, you're crazy, because feminists won't read the book because it's male scholarship, and male scholars or the guild won't read the book because it's feminist. And when I realized this contradiction, I decided I wanted to do it, have it a feminist perspective, but still keep my male, which I don't believe in, but keep it as a scholarly kind of approach. And it turned out I was wrong. I mean, it turned out that many feminists, many women around the world have found the book helpful, but it is also a book which is here used in many college classes and in many seminaries. So it also had some impact in the academy. But I think it is because it opens up a new kind of field which is feminist studies in early Christianity.
You suggest that after Jesus' death, women spread the gospel.
Yeah, what is striking in terms of the Gospels, Paul says that the basic Christian confession was that Jesus died, he was buried, and he was raised from the dead. And if you look at the gospel texts, then in all gospels it's women among them, leading among them Mary of Magdala, who are present at the execution of Jesus, at the burial of Jesus, and who are proclaiming the resurrection, or are told to proclaim the resurrection. So you could say that there is already in the Gospels a kind of competition going on in the texts between Peter and Mary of Magdala. Who is the first? Yeah. Who is the first? Is it Peter or is it Mary of Magdala? And for instance, in the Gospel of John, the story is so told that Peter becomes the first, and Mary only has after. The story begins with Mary, and then a Peter story is sliced in, and then the story of Mary of Magdala, and Jesus is finished. So you can see how it's at work, and why we can say so is because especially the texts which have been found in Nag Hammadi and so-called Gnostic texts, and also later texts have practically, especially anti-Montanist texts, have practically a debate going on between Peter and Mary of Magdala, who understood the resurrection best. So I always say, if we have a chair of Peter, a cathedra of Peter, we need to have a cathedra of Mary of Magdala. And there you can see how texts how texts within a text become historically effective and have impact historically depends on who is developing them. So the great church has developed Peter, but not Mary of Magdala. If you look at what happened to Mary of Magdala in the Western tradition, not in the Eastern Church, but in the Western Church tradition, Mary of Magdala is still recognized by some of the church fathers and early medieval theologians as the apostle to the apostles. But at the same time, she is identified with the public sinner who in Luke anoints Jesus, and she becomes therefore the prostitute and the whore. And like when I taught at Notre Dame, which is a Catholic university, at college, I would always say, and they were very anxious to get good grades, and so I would always say, if you say Mary of Magdala was a whore or a prostitute, you will drop, your grade will drop 2 grades down. But even this threat didn't help. I mean, you would still get students who would insist that Mary was a prostitute. And if you look at Jesus Christ Superstar, so on modern culture, still elaborates the same kind of bad woman kind of motif, which the tradition, Christian tradition, has elaborated.
I wanted to ask some general questions. Who is God to you?
Why is that an important question?
Well,
I mean,
how do you
let me
picture
reformulate
him or her?
it. Whoever God to me is does not really matter as long as I don't say my God or to be your God. That means the dangerous thing of religion is always not that they articulate who God is for them, but that they articulate who God should be for others. So for me, the issue of God is really a question, a theological question, and in feminist terms, a question of language. I have emphasized so strongly the issue of language, and traditional theology has always said that our language is inadequate, human language is inadequate to speak about God. So in my understanding, what is important for the theologian is exactly that we look very critically and very carefully at how we speak about God. Because how we speak about God will depend or will have implications on how we treat people. And religions have too much used God in order to against other people. And in feminist terms, you have a big discussion about whether our God language in the tradition as well as in scripture is male. So the feminists have insisted, because our language, and especially male, grammatically male language, is inadequate for God, we have to revisit all our speaking about God if we do not want to continue to reinforce through God language the second-class citizenship of women. There have been many different suggestions made on how to speak about God.
What does prayer mean to you?
Again, that is, the questions come from a kind of New Age spirituality, which I have difficulty with. I should give you back. Matthew has a nice text which I usually quote, because generally religion or religious practice is understood in terms of prayer or in terms of liturgy. And that is seen as the typical Christian. But if you look at the gospel text, for instance, in Matthew's text, we have a clear-cut statement. If you pray, don't do it publicly. Go in your pantry, close the door, and then you pray. That means prayer is not something for public consumption, but prayer is something between you and God, and you be careful that you do not make it something for public consumption.
How would you define your relationship with traditional Catholic Church?
My relationship, I always say I'm as Catholic as the Pope is. because I have I've grown up in a term of kind of folk Catholicism, and that is quite different from the American Catholicism, that is immigrant Catholicism. So for me, as I said in the beginning, the Council is very decisive, and the Council understands the Church as the baptized, or as the people of God. And the hierarchy, what you probably mean with
I do.
Vision Church, and the hierarchy are there for the service of the people of God. And so for me, Church is not to be identified with a hierarchy.
How do you picture the ideal Church?
I would say that one of my utopian expression is discipleship of equals in terms of church. I would think as a minimum And there I again am very much formed by council theology. I would think two things. With the church ought to be, as theologians say, church is a sacrament of salvation, and if one takes salvation out of the traditional kind of theological lingo and translate it with liberation, then the church needs to be the sacrament of liberation, and, or in other words, the church needs to be the sacrament of justice in a world of injustice. And that means that within the church cannot be the sacrament of justice if within the church you don't have just structures.
What are most important problems of present-day society?
For me, the most problematic issues are still the issues of racism, sexism, of all the isms, but especially also in terms of neoliberalism and in terms of the globalization, what I began in the beginning, the uprooting of people and the disenfranchisement of people. The former Labor Secretary Reich, who was also a professor here at Harvard, has projected that if nothing drastically changes, is that in the next years, around 70 to 80% of the world population will be under the poverty level. That means will be condemned to impoverishment, whereas only 10 to 15% will have enough to live, and that is an alarming kind of projection for the future.
What is the role of church and religion in the 21st century?
There I would like to say the 21st century, I mean, there will be a big celebration that the millennium and the change, that is a typical Christian kind of view of the world and of history. So I would say the role will not be different than in the 20th century, but I would think that religion and churches will only have, insofar as they lose more and more the instruments of power which they have gained from the state, will only have significance if they are justice promoting religions or churches, and if they are able in their own vision and theology to articulate this as a spirituality of global justice.
Thank you, Professor Schüssler Fiorenza, for this interview.
You're welcome.